It's my pleasure to introduce you to the chair of this first panel. Liza Black is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, meaning Cherokee Nation claims her as a citizen. She is an associate professor of history and Native American and Indigenous studies at Indiana University and is working on a book, a manuscript, How to Get Away with Murder. That's a good title. Which is on the transnational history of missing and murdered Indigenous women. So please give her a hand, Liza Black.
Thank you so much, Wolf. Good morning, everybody. CO. I want to start by giving some love to Lorena, Dorota, Wolf, Martha, the Native American Student Council, and our tech people. You have hosted an amazing event. And I really want to thank our audience, those of you who are here with us in person and those here by Zoom. We see you and we're glad you're here too. I'm going to go ahead and give a trigger warning and a content warning now. I was planning to do one just before my talk, but I think I'll just go ahead and do it now, which is just to say, please take care of yourself as you listen, and even later, you know, as the day progresses, as the weeks go on, especially if you are a survivor. So we'll be hearing today first from Karine Duhamel. She is Anishinaabe-Métis and a member of Red Rock First Nation. She holds a Bachelor of Arts from Mount Allison University, a Bachelor of Education from Lakehead University, and a master's degree and PhD in history from the University of Manitoba. Dr. Duhamel was formerly adjunct professor at the University of Winnipeg and director of research for Church Law Corporation. From 2016 to 2018, she also served as curator at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. More recently, Dr. Duhamel served as director of research for the Historic National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, drafting the final report, as well as managing its forensic document review project and legacy archive. Dr. Duhamel is now a full-time public servant working to implement the National Inquiry's calls for justice, as well as a consultant working with organizations across the country to develop new approaches to research that embrace Indigenous ways of knowing. She is also an active member of several boards and committees, including the Canadian Historical Association, the International Council of Museums, and the International Council on Archives. Dr. Duhamel is a frequently requested speaker for the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. Thank you, and we'll hear from Karine now.
No problem. All right. I'm just going to lower this a little bit. So, Ani Buju, Mamuino Kijig, Karine Duhamel, Nindishnakaz, Gauko Singh, Nindonjiba, Besho Miskazibi, Nindwa, or Ninda, Red Rock Indian Band. Good morning, everybody. It's a real honor to be here this morning. It's a smaller group, but I'm really excited to see you all, and I'm really very honored to be able to talk to you today about the work that we did as part of the National Inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This is a tremendously significant project in Canada, but that one that I think can have important repercussions for the work ahead. And centering, I think, the voices of families and survivors in this work has implications for what we do next. So just to give you a sense of this issue, you know, we often talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in the language of crisis. And while it is a crisis in terms of its scope and scale, it's really important to understand that this is a crisis centuries in the making. It's not new. It hasn't just been going on for a few years. This is something that's been going on for a long time. So according to recent data releases, 64% of First Nations, 65% of Métis, and 45% of Inuit women report having experienced violent victimization in their lifetime. This is a pretty staggering statistic. In addition, in 2021, and partially as a result of the pandemic, the Violent Crime Severity Index increased in Canada by 5%, and the homicide rate is currently 6 times higher for Indigenous people than non-Indigenous people, and even higher for Indigenous women. Indigenous people are 10 times more likely than non-Indigenous people to have been in state care. These are important as framing mechanisms, but they aren't the whole story. when we did the national inquiry, we really wanted to hear from families and survivors. And in fact, the roots of the inquiry, for those of you that are not familiar with it, come from really two main sources. The first is the decades-long advocacy of families and survivors, some of whom, put posters on their car and drove across the country, just kept speaking out and kept talking about the fact that they were unable to find justice within the Canadian system. The second impetus for the national inquiry was, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's 2015 report and its call to action 41 that called for a national inquiry into this issue, specifically because survivors of the residential school system talked very frequently in their testimonies for the TRC about the impact of violence in communities and the way in which women, girls, and two-spirit and transgender people have been and continue to be targeted for violence. The inquiry started really started in 2017, but was declared earlier than that. And the mandate given to the national inquiry was enormous. We were asked to look into and report on the systemic causes of all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls, including sexual violence. We're also asked to examine the underlying social, economic, cultural, institutional, and historical causes that contribute to violence. And third, we were asked to look into and report on best practices or promising practices to confront violence. As you can see from the mandate, there's no start or end date, and there's also no fixed geographical location. And so this was an enormous project. And the mandate, as it was framed, presented both, I think, a tremendous challenge, but also a big opportunity, because it allowed us, and me particularly, having been trained as a historian, to reach a lot further back and as far back as necessary to better understand the roots of the violence today. So the challenge to the mandate, though, was that, you can read it. It's an enormous amount of work for 2 years of a mandate. And so we had to really think about, what was most important? What did we want to prioritize? What did we want to do? And how could we really tackle such a big issue and say something important about it in the time that we had? We had a truth gathering process, and because of how we saw this work, we wanted to start with family members and survivors. In particular, we wanted to hear from them because we really saw them as the real experts in this. We talked a little bit this week about truth, but in reality, there's nothing truer than what people have experienced and what they're feeling. And so these were the stories that we wanted to start with. These were the experiences that we wanted to best understand. And so the truth gathering process had 3 parts. Part 1 focused on family members and survivors. We heard from over 1,400 families and survivors in the context of community hearings, 14 community hearings across the country. People could also testify by submitting a statement. So we would have trained statement gatherers that would go to the communities or to the community centers or to people's homes, wherever they felt was a safe place, and take their statement. We also had in-camera hearings. So if a case was ongoing or if sharing information might jeopardize the outcome of the prosecution, people could testify in camera. And really importantly, and for the first time in history, in any inquiry or commission that I'm aware of anyways, we created something called the Legacy Archive, which was the opportunity for Indigenous families and survivors to testify through artistic expression. And we weighted those expressions the same as we did any other kind of evidence that we received. The Legacy Archive has over 800 pieces, beadwork, sculpture, songs, poems, paintings, anything that you can think of in terms of how people felt was most important to express what had happened to their loved one, and also the importance of that person in their lives still. And so one of the images on the screen is the star blanket. That was a good example of some of the work that the Legacy Archive did. It was created as a result of a statement gathering event in Vancouver, British Columbia, where people gave statements and then they had the opportunity to decorate a tile in honor of their loved one. And then we had an artist that put it together into this beautiful, beautiful piece. The importance of including the legacy archive is something I just want to pause on for a moment because it tells a very different story. When we think about inquiries and commissions, we're very used to technical stuff, right? We're used to experts and reports and things that are in writing. The legacy archive was really an opportunity for family members to consider how they might want to express that loss and how they might want to think about their loved one going forward. And so it was it's both a really beautiful collection, but it was, as people talked about, also a way to engage and to start the healing process in terms of thinking about, what's next and what they wanted to do next. That was part one, and it was a huge part. And then we also held a series of guided dialogues that brought together frontline service providers and family members to talk about solutions going forward. We also had parts 2 and 3, which brought together government officials, experts, academics, and others, only about 85 people. And so really the evidentiary record is very weighted in favor of the experiences of families and survivors. Importantly, the national inquiry, as it was structured in Canada, is actually 14 concurrent inquiries, 1 national, 1 in 13, and 1 in each province and territory. And the reason that it was set up that way is because it allowed us to subpoena evidence from both provincial officials and federal officials. And so the equivalent of state officials here, because otherwise we would have only been able to focus on things like the RCMP and federal decision makers. And we really knew that, especially in how services are delivered for Indigenous people in Canada, and especially as of 1951, when many of them were transferred to the provinces to deliver in key areas like health and education, that it was really important to talk to folks about that. In the end, our report produced 4 root causes that we argue maintain colonial violence. The first is unresolved multi-generational and intergenerational trauma. The second is economic and social marginalization and political marginalization. The third is lack of political will on behalf of decision makers and maintaining the status quo. And the fourth is the ongoing denial of the agency and expertise of Indigenous women and 2S LGBTQI+ people. In every story that we heard, and it didn't matter if the person was old or young, or if they came from a remote community or an urban center, all of these things came together in different ways. I can say there wasn't one story that we heard where somebody didn't have an experience of their parents or grandparents being expelled from the land or ripped out of their communities. There wasn't one person that we talked to that lived in a place that they didn't want to live in that felt like they could get out of that, right? Nobody chose to live in an unsafe neighborhood or an unsafe community. Nobody chose to have to find alternative ways to get to work or to school. These were all very active parts of the colonial story, historic and ongoing. The lack of political will, well, that's pretty clear. You're a historian, and we've heard about this over the last few days, and I am. We looked into the archives, and we found many, many cases where officials knew what was going on, and they chose not to do anything about it. And fourth, the denial of the agency and expertise of Indigenous women and 2S LGBTQI+ people. The amount of times that we heard about programs that were actually making a difference in the community, that were run and conceived by the community, that had a link to place and a link to the heart and the teachings that people carried with them, no matter where they came from. And those programs were not funded or not supported, was a really staggering part of what we found. This was shown yesterday, so I won't get into this painting just to save on time. But in Canada, it's important to keep in mind that the state infrastructure and the state police infrastructure that existed here in the military did not exist in Canada historically. And the RCMP, which was originally the Northwest Mounted Police that was created in the late 19th century, was modeled on the Royal Irish Constabulary, which was a service that was established essentially to stamp down the Irish, right? And so they created this structure in Canada to stamp down Indigenous people, but it didn't have the reach, and it didn't have the funding, and it didn't have the power of an army necessarily. And so the Canadian government had to use them, but also get a little bit creative, and it did, by aligning with the churches, by creating legislation that has and continues to disenfranchise Indigenous women and their children, and by doing things in a different kind of a way that still have the same kind of impact. and people know it. History matters today and for the future, and this is just one example, and we had a panel about this. This data is a little bit dated, it comes from the 2016 census, and there's a new census that's just come out, so I expect this will be updated. But as an example, right, in Canada, Indigenous children are apprehended at a much higher rate than the population would suggest. There's many people that argue that residential schools have become, or child welfare is the new residential school system, that incarceration is the new residential school system, right? And it's just one example of so many that I can share that people talked about, of the kinds of state-sanctioned, state-sponsored violence that continues to occur in Canada. Of course, working for an inquiry or a commission is really difficult because what you're expected to do is essentially write a book and say what you'd like to happen, and then you kind of have to wait around to see if they're going to do anything about it. Indigenous women have been speaking out about this issue far long before the national inquiry, and there are scores of reports from Indigenous people, written by Indigenous people, with recommendations that have not been implemented. So because I have a bit of a background in human rights, we started to try to think about how we could try to build accountability into a process that is inherently unaccountable, right? We're not a court, we cannot adjudicate, but what we could do is look at the commitments that Canada has made and continues to make publicly, and to demonstrate the way in which it violates these commitments for Indigenous women, girls, and to us LGBTQI+ people. It's important to think about how you can implement something, some degree of accountability for families in something that's not designed to be that way. And for lots of family members that spoke to us, they had been through all of the regular channels. They had tried everything and nothing had happened. So we came together as a research team and we said, you know, what are some things we can maybe sow the seeds right now, put in place to think about if in 2 years, if in 3 years, if in 5 years, nothing's happened, people have something to go back to. And what we came to was thinking about international human rights laws and conventions that could potentially have an impact on this. So there are a few on the screen. The one that I'll focus on for the purposes of today is the Genocide Convention, but we also looked at the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Violence Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is a very important one in Canadian context in terms of the child welfare question, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which is just now being implemented into Canadian law under the UN Declaration Act. But for today, we'll focus on the finding of genocide. So we found that the violence the national inquiry heard about amounts to a race-based genocide of Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, which especially targets women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI+ people. This genocide has been empowered by colonial structures, evidenced notably in the Indian Act, the 60s Scoop, residential schools, and breaches of human and Indigenous rights, leading directly to the current increased rates of violence, death, and suicide in Indigenous populations. Of course, this came out and everybody accused us of not really knowing what we were talking about and fundamentally misunderstanding the convention and everything that went with it. But a lot of these kind of comments were really based in a very old understanding of what the convention is and what it does. I think that for those of you, and we've talked a little bit about this over the last couple of days, that are familiar with the convention, it is important to note that it's in its original kind of theorization by Raphael Lemkin in 1944, it was a much broader concept. Right? Raphael Lemkin talked about, I'm sorry, I do have to go to my notes here, you know, elements of political, cultural, biological, religious, social, economic, physical, and moral genocide. And in fact, as a result of the kind of protests of countries like Canada, allied with the United States and many in Western Europe, Article 3, which spoke to culture and cultural genocide, was in fact dropped from that convention because they threatened not to sign it if it wasn't. So for me, when people raise this genocide question in relation to MMIWG, I really ask if a political agreement, a compromise from 1948 which is largely structured through the lens of political expediency and pragmatism, should in fact be the operational basis for how we examine and evaluate these events today? I don't think so. And although I'm not a lawyer, I will say that people that are lawyers and have done a lot of work in this area will tell you that the law is not static. The law is dynamic. It's built on precedents. And so why should this be any different? For us, and you're all familiar with this convention, but looking at the events that occurred in Canada does fulfill all of these definitional elements, right? People have been killed. People have been seriously harmed mentally and bodily. Conditions of life have been inflicted on groups. Measures have been imposed to prevent births, and certainly children have and are being forcibly transferred from one group to the other. Canada is one of the strangest places in the world because we still have an Indian Act. And this is always, whenever I talk in other places other than Canada, people are like, what? You have what? We still have an Indian Act. I'm re-registered under the Indian Act, but I will not register. I can't register my kids. That will end with me. I'm the last person in my family that can be registered under the Indian Act, myself and my sister, right? And so it's really important to think about where there's not a military strategy, where there's not a physical state solution, what are the other ways that this occurs? What are the other ways that this happens? In Canada, we have genocide on paper, right? But it's no less harmful. In talking with some of the elders, we talked about losing status, and they talked about how historically banishment was akin to a death sentence, and how they felt that the Indian Act really banished people, right? And so it was akin to that. And so we can haggle over definition and intent, but at the end of the day, states don't have intent, states have policies, and those policies embody intent. And that's the argument that we made in the final report, and it's the argument that we made in the supplemental report on genocide that we created specifically for the people who we know would say we didn't know what we were talking about and we had misunderstood this work. At the end of the day, genocide, as we've talked about, oh geez, I'm gonna have to speed up. No, that's okay. Has conduct actus reus and intent mens rea. And we feel like looking at the history and looking at what's going on today embody those things. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because there's something that I do want to show you that's really important. Ultimately, what family members and survivors told us is that what happened to their loved ones were a series of moments where they went to access a service, to engage with an institution or a government, and that those moments that we would traditionally associate with relationship building were in fact corrupted, and they led people down a path to harm rather than to healing. I am an optimist, and I said, and my research team said, what would have happened if that person could have gotten help? What would have happened if they looked for help and it was there, or they went to that service and it was provided in a non-racist and non-discriminatory way? And so we really felt like this encounters framework, the idea of empowering new kinds of encounters, the idea that everybody has a role to play here. Governments have a role, but people do too. And people make up governments, and we cannot forget that in this work. I think that remembering is an anti-colonial act. And in every story that we heard, people didn't start with what happened to their loved one. They started out by telling us how Deidre had a big laugh that filled the room and she loved to bake muffins. They started out by telling us about Liza, who made her brother's lunch and cut his hair and who loved The Little Mermaid. They told us about Amber, who loved to dance and who was a pipe carrier. They didn't start with what happened to them. And as somebody said to us, my mother is more than what happened to her. And I think that's really important too. So obviously I'm almost out of time, but I'm very happy to take questions, but I would like to stop talking and I would like to share something with you. This is a video that was made by our National Family Advisory Circle. It's a group of family members who testified and who wanted to play a bigger role in the national inquiry. And they traveled with us and we laughed and we created our own family. We played jokes on each other and we sat around and we drank tea and you know, in all of that, we created our community, we created our family. But they have something really important to say. And so my job's not to tell you what I think, although I have many thoughts, is to tell you what they thought. And so I'm going to let them talk for themselves.
Je suis ma grand-mère.
I am my mother.
Je suis ma sœur.
I am my auntie.
Anna la star.
I am my daughter.
I
am my wife.
I am my best friend.
We are the families and survivors of missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Girls, two-spirited, and trans people.
We are the voices of our lost loved ones who are calling out to be found.
And we echo their cries for justice.
We shed tears
We shed tears for our sisters.
Nous sommes restés en arrière
to tell their stories
pour protéger la vérité.
Our ancestors protected our ways so we could survive and persevere.
Our relationship with Canada was created in peace,
Friendship, and trust.
la paix, l'amitié et la confiance.
Promising prosperity.
Abundance and well-being.
La confiance brisée a érodé.
Broken trust has eroded this relationship.
Jeopardizing what we hold most sacred.
Our women and girls.
Nos femmes et nos filles.
We are here to restore their dignity
And forge a path for change.
Our children are our future.
We must protect them.
Nous devons les protéger.
We ask all Canadians
To stay with us.
To stand with us.
in ending all forms of violence.
Learn about the truthful
La vraie histoire
of the relationship between First Nation,
Inuit and Métis people and Canada.
Honor that truth by upholding their rights.
by upholding their rights and respecting our sisters.
et en respectant leurs valeurs.
Our language,
Our treaties and our way of life.
with clean water, housing, and safety.
And respecting our women, our children, and our families.
Donner vie à la vérité en devenant des alliés.
By becoming allies and advocating for change needed. I love you, baby.
Good job.
Thank you so much.
Taken, not forgotten.
Taken, not forgotten.
I am here to speak for those who cannot speak.
Our women and girls are sacred.
Our women and girls are sacred.
I'm here for justice.
I am a change maker. Are you?
J'initie le changement. Et vous?
I am a change maker. Are you?
So those are the families. Oh, I don't want to play that again. I want to stop that now. Those are the families, and I
Je
just
suis ma
oh my
grand-mère.
gosh. And it's really important to keep them in this work. Ultimately, they are the experts. They know what happened, and to do this work in a trauma-informed way, and to understand this message, and to embody this idea that our women, girls, and 2S LGBTQI+ people are sacred, means that all of us have an action to do, whether you write the checks, you answer the phone, right? And so anyways, thank you very much for your time. Chimigwech, and happy to take any questions.
So we have a few minutes for Q&A, and I wanted to try out something different that I haven't seen people do at the conference yet. And I wanted to try out Eve Tuck's method for Q&A, which is that everybody turns to somebody near them to share with them their thought or their comment or their question, and you peer review each other. You sort of collaborate together on what could or should be asked of our speakers. So you don't have to ask a question. It can also be a comment, just a reflection, but work together. work together and chat with the people near you. And also if you need something to drink or eat, please feel free to grab something together. So whenever your group is ready, just raise your hand and our student representative will bring you the microphone.
Go. Okay. So thank you very much for your presentation. I've heard you talk a number of times, and every time you present, I learned something new. So thank you for all the work that you've done, because I know that inquiry was not easy. You know, I am so grateful for the hours that you spent and the hurdles that you went through in getting the report done. So miigwech. Yeah. The question that I have is you mentioned the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Mm-hmm. So the Department of Canadian Justice is now looking at how federal laws can align to ensure that UNDRIP is implemented in Canada. And they're going across the country right now, and they're asking Indigenous peoples what are sort of the key areas, how can this be done, and what are kind of the asks within our laws to ensure that Indigenous voices are heard, but also that the laws align with the UN Declaration. And I know that when we go into our communities, they are going to talk about the violence that is continuing against Indigenous women and girls and men, right? So I'm just wondering if you have any insight, just because of your knowledge of the report, so detailed, of whether there is something that you would recommend that is very important for the federal laws to ensure that there is some kind of process to empower new kinds of encounters between Indigenous peoples. I just was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. So my experience, and I say this with love, in working with lots of colleagues in justice, is that they have a very limited imagination, and they like to interpret things as narrowly as possible, because that's what lawyers often do. It's how you're trained, right? I think for me, the issue of free, prior, and informed consent can go a very long way, but it has to be interpreted much more broadly than they will. So they will say that free, prior, and informed consent is about land specifically, and only land and only that. But I think that there's an opportunity for Indigenous communities to talk about what that might actually mean in a much more comprehensive and meaningful way, because I think it does relate to things like violence, and it does relate to sovereignty, and it does relate to all of those things. So from my perspective, that, and again, the biggest opportunity is under FPIC, or free, prior, and informed consent, in terms of thinking about how the UNDA might be implemented in a way that's actually meaningful and can be actioned in a way that supports Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous laws. Thanks.
So as a team over here, we discussed immediately responsibility to protect in terms of international law and Canada historically in the world appearing to care about those things. And so Dorota shared that, and I said, I want to take that one step further. And we're sovereign nations within nations. So what does it mean for Canada to push the responsibility to protect, to extend to First Nations people to have the right to have their own armies again, or monitor their own lands deeper? Coming from someone who has family members who have gone missing and been found dead, and a lot of friends who have also the search parties that exist, the immediate trauma that comes over to the point where everyone is out looking. I always imagine, coming from the US perspective, federally recognized versus state, federally recognized nations, some of them have their own tribal police forces that are really amazing and like together in terms of the finances, right? And the ability.
Yeah.
For those of us who don't have that, or in terrains that are still, I mean, when you think about where reservations are, we're all 2 to 3 hours apart from each other, even though we might be sister nations, or there's a mountain range in the way, or there's a swamp in the way. How do we monitor our own lands, but also under the colonial dime of them already saying that they do these things?
Yeah, it's a great question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add, and I guess kind of tack on for UNDRIP and my own personal frustration, considering I've gone to United Nations school. UNDRIP is not legally binding, right? It's a declaration. It's becoming common law, but why? And yeah, the implementation of it is where we're seeing a little bit of a disconnect, especially considering, Canada is one of the countries to wait to sign it, the US and other nations.
Yeah, for sure. So thanks for your question. There's a lot there, but I think I'll focus on kind of the security element. So it's true that, so two things. Number one, part of the reason that the RCMP is able to be in communities is the way that communities are often and deliberately rendered kind of inaccessible or less accessible by where they're placed or how much infrastructure exists. And so it continues to allow the state to encroach in communities, particularly in the area of policing, because a lot of them are underserviced in that way, right? I think the issue, and we have to be conscious, I'm an urban Indigenous person and I've always lived in Winnipeg, but my community is not, right? Like my community is Red Rocks in Ontario. And there is at least, what demography tells us is at least 50% of Indigenous people now live in urban centers. So we also need to think about what that looks like for urban Indigenous people who are often in new communities that they have formed. In Winnipeg, we have something called the Bear Clan, and the Bear Clan is a community patrol. You likely heard about it. Goes out, it talks to people. It's not police. It's more of a it interacts with people, and Bear Clan members do a lot of really important work, but they're underfunded and they're always looking for volunteers, right? I think that empowering those kind of services to be self-determined, but it is important, but we need to do it and consider it not only in a First Nations reserve context, but in an urban context, in Inuit Nunangat, for Inuit that live in urban centers, and for Métis. Right. And so it becomes a really complicated landscape, but it doesn't take away from the principle that I think that you're saying, which is that, we have our own laws and we have ways of doing it. And in fact, that's what people that's what people told us in the inquiry, right? The people would say, we've always had these laws in our community. When somebody transgressed, it's not that these communities were perfect, but when somebody did wrong, we had a way to deal with it. And we want to do that again. Right? So I think there's a balance there, but we can't forget about the 50% of people that don't live in their community. And we also can't forget about the way that actually underdevelopment of infrastructure to communities allows this to continue and allows the state to continue to reach its long fingers into those communities and to claim that there's nothing else that can be done, right? So thanks for your question.
Thank you for your presentation. We were wondering regarding the video that you showed at last, who is this video addressed to? Because you mentioned a few times the denials that there are regarding the violence. And of course, we are talking about crime, so there are responsibles.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, great question. And I can answer that pretty speedily because I think I am probably out of time. So we created a campaign called Sacred MMIWG, and it included the videos, but it also included like a social media campaign, because we understand that not everybody's going to pick up the report. Not everybody's going to read it. The importance of the encounters framework is to say that everybody has encounters in different ways in their lives, and everybody can kind of look at what they do, where they work, who they talk to, their families, their community, and figure out what their action can be, because ultimately governments don't drive movements, people drive movements, people build safety, governments don't build safety. So the video is something that the family members wanted to do. We also have one by the Grandmother's Circle to really talk directly to Canadians and to say, look at, we understand that there's a tendency to look at MMIWG and look at numbers and look at what government should do, but everybody needs to know this and everybody needs to do this. So I would say it's addressed to most Canadians, and I don't think deniers would appreciate the video anyways for what it is, but family members wrote that script. We didn't write it. Family members decided they wanted to bring pictures of their loved ones. We didn't ask them to do that, right? So it really is, I think, I show it because it is, I think, the most true compilation of what we heard and demonstrates, what drives it. And it is this idea that our women and girls are sacred. And it is the idea that everybody can be a change maker. And I'll continue to believe that, right? It's not gonna be fast, but it will happen. Thanks.
Thank you so much.